In the vast expanse of the African savanna, where the sun beats down mercilessly and the night brings terrors that most creatures can barely comprehend, there are stories that transcend the ordinary boundaries of nature, stories that remind us that the wild operates by rules far more complex than we ever imagined. This is one of those stories, a story that begins not with triumph or glory, but with devastation, a story about a lioness who lost everything in a single catastrophic night, and what she did afterward would change the very fabric of her pride forever, leaving even the most seasoned wildlife researchers scrambling to understand what they were witnessing. Her name was Amara. She was a 7-year-old lioness in the prime of her life, the kind of apex predator that embodied everything we imagine when we picture the African savanna, strong, intelligent, and fiercely protective of her family. But on the night of October 18, 2019, in the heart of the Serengeti National Park, Amara's world would shatter in ways that seemed almost impossible to survive. The story of what happened that night, and what unfolded in the weeks and months after, challenges everything we thought we knew about lion behavior, about grief, about the capacity for transformation in the animal kingdom. Before we dive deeper into this incredible and terrifying saga, I want you to understand just how rare and extraordinary this story truly is. If you love real wildlife stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, stories that reveal the raw complexity of animal behavior and intelligence, then you absolutely need to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell right now, because what you're about to witness is something that very few people have ever seen documented. And trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of what comes next. Amara lived with her pride in the Ngorongoro region, one of the most beautiful and abundant territories in all of Tanzania. The pride consisted of 12 members, 9 lionesses including Amara, and 3 large males who held dominion over their vast domain. The territory was paradise by African standards. Water was abundant. Prey moved through the plains in endless processions. Buffalo herds darkened the grasslands during migration season. Zebras and wildebeest provided consistent hunting opportunities. For Amara, life in this pride represented everything a lioness could want: security, community, purpose. But Amara had something more than just a place in the pride. She had a family that she loved with a ferocity that would later define her entire existence. 3 cubs, 2 males and 1 female, born just 18 months earlier during the rainy season when the land was lush and green. The female cub, whom the rangers had named Zara, was Amara's pride and joy. Intelligent beyond her years, Zara showed signs of becoming a formidable huntress. The 2 male cubs were more playful, less serious, but equally beloved. Every morning, Amara would spend hours teaching them to hunt, showing them how to read the wind, how to understand the behavioral patterns of prey, how to move through the grass without making a sound. The other lionesses in the pride treated Amara with respect. She was a skilled hunter, perhaps one of the best in the entire pride. Her strategic mind set her apart from her sisters. While other lionesses relied primarily on brute strength and coordinated group tactics, Amara could analyze a hunting scenario and develop approaches that maximized success while minimizing risk. She had taught the younger lionesses techniques they had never seen before. She had earned her position not through aggression, but through competence and intelligence. Life in the pride followed rhythms that had remained unchanged for generations. Hunt at dawn and dusk, rest during the heat of the day, socialize around waterholes, defend territory from rival prides, raise cubs, mate during breeding season. This was the cycle of existence, safe, predictable, the way things had always been. But nature, as anyone who has spent time studying the African wilderness knows, rarely remains predictable for long. Danger lurks constantly in the savanna, wearing 1,000 different faces. Sometimes it comes from rival lions, sometimes from hyenas or wild dogs, sometimes from the very prey animals themselves, like buffalo with their deadly horns. But on October 18, 2019, danger came in a form that nobody in Amara's pride could have anticipated. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Amara led her 3 cubs toward a particularly abundant watering hole called the Chakra Springs. The springs were located about 4 kilometers from the pride's main resting area, in a valley surrounded by acacia trees and rocky outcrops. The location had always been considered safe. Rangers had observed the pride using this watering hole for years without incident. The surrounding terrain provided good visibility in all directions. There were multiple escape routes if danger appeared. By every measure, it should have been routine. The cubs played in the shallow water while Amara watched from a nearby outcrop, her golden eyes scanning the horizon for threats. This was standard operating procedure. A mother's vigilance never ceased, never wavered. She had been doing this for 18 months without incident. She would do it for countless more years, she thought. But as the light began to fade and the first stars emerged in the darkening sky, something changed. The wind shifted, and with it came a scent that made Amara's entire body go rigid. Hyenas, not just a few, not a small clan, but a massive aggregation, at least 60 strong, moving through the valley with coordinated purpose. Hyenas were always dangerous. Their jaws could crush bone. They hunted in packs with a ferocity that belied their appearance. But lions usually dominated hyenas. A mother with 3 cubs was obviously vulnerable, but she was still a lioness. She was still formidable, still dangerous. Amara made a decision in that instant that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She decided to fight rather than flee. The cubs were tired from playing. Running 4 kilometers would exhaust them. Better to make a stand here, at the springs, where she had the high ground and good visibility. Better to trust in her strength, her intelligence, her ferocity. She called the cubs to her and positioned them behind a large rock formation. Then she moved forward to meet the approaching threat. What happened in the next 17 minutes would become the subject of intense study by wildlife researchers for years to come. James Chen, a wildlife photographer who happened to be camped less than 2 kilometers away, heard the commotion and rushed toward the sound with his camera. He arrived just as the confrontation was reaching its peak, and what he documented would change everything. The hyena clan had surrounded Amara and her cubs, 60 animals coordinating their movements with precision. They knew that a lone lioness, even a formidable one, could be overwhelmed through sheer numbers. They knew that cubs were vulnerable. They knew this was an opportunity. Amara fought like something possessed. Chen's footage showed her moving with almost superhuman speed and ferocity. She would dart left, slashing with claws that could tear through flesh like paper. She would pivot right, her jaws snapping at any hyena that came within reach. She killed at least 5 of them in those first moments. 5 animals that would never hunt again. But there were 60, and the cubs were screaming. The sound of their distress was agony for Amara, dividing her attention, fracturing her focus. And that was when the tide turned. A coalition of particularly large male hyenas coordinated an assault from multiple angles. While Amara was focused on defending against attackers from the front, they came at her from the sides and rear. One clamped its jaws onto her back leg, another went for her shoulder. The third targeted her face. For the first time in the battle, Amara screamed, not a roar, a scream, an expression of raw pain and desperation that Chen said he would never forget. She killed the hyena, targeting her face with a vicious bite that crushed its skull. But the damage was done. Blood poured from multiple wounds. Her movements became slower, more desperate. The cubs were no longer screaming. They had gone silent, the most terrible silence Chen said he had ever heard. When Amara finally managed to break free from the hyena assault and stumbled toward the rock where she had left her cubs, what she found would destroy something fundamental inside her. All 3 cubs were gone. The 2 males lay motionless on the ground, their small bodies torn and broken. Zara, her precious daughter, was nowhere to be found. In the chaos of the battle, hyenas had dragged her away into the darkness. Amara's anguished roar that night could be heard for over 15 kilometers. Rangers stationed at different outposts reported hearing it. Tourists in nearby lodges reported hearing it. It was the sound of a mother's world ending, the sound of everything she loved being torn away in a single, unbearable night. By the time Amara's pride arrived at the Chakra Springs, nearly 40 minutes later, the hyenas had fled into the darkness. The 2 male cubs were already beginning to cool. Amara stood over their bodies, making soft, mournful calls that no one had heard from a lion before. The other lionesses tried to comfort her, but she would not be comforted. She would not leave the bodies. She would not move. She simply stood there, staring at nothing, her body covered in blood and wounds, her spirit broken beyond measure. As dawn broke over the Serengeti, revealing the scene in harsh detail, even the most experienced rangers knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was not simply grief. This was devastation. This was a complete shattering of everything that made life worth living. What happened over the next 3 days would be documented in detail by Chen and the research team that had rushed to the area. Amara did not eat. She did not drink. She did not leave the side of her two dead cubs. She lay beside them, her body pressed against theirs, making the softest, most heartbreaking calls. The other lionesses tried to encourage her to hunt, knowing that her wounds needed energy to heal. She refused. By the third day she was still there, her condition worsening, the infection setting in at her wounds. The research team actually began to worry that she would die, that grief would simply consume her until there was nothing left. But then something changed. On the morning of the fourth day, Amara stood. Slowly, painfully, she rose to her feet. She looked at her two dead cubs one final time, and then she walked away from the springs, away from her pride, away from everything familiar. The other lionesses called to her, but she did not answer. She simply walked toward the northern territories, territories that belonged to rival prides, territories that were dangerous and unforgiving. The research team followed at a distance, documenting her movements, unable to predict what she would do next. And that was when the true horror of what came next began to unfold. That was when Amara's grief would transform into something far more terrifying, something that would make even the most hardened observers question everything they understood about the animal kingdom and the capacity for revenge. The northern territories of the Serengeti belonged to the Kizingo Pride, a coalition of 8 lionesses and 2 large males who had ruled that region for over a decade. They were fierce competitors. They were known for their ruthlessness. They had fought Amara's pride on numerous occasions, and the battles had always been fierce and bloody. Normally, a lioness wandering alone into enemy territory would be attacked on sight. She would be driven away or killed. There were no exceptions to this rule. It was the law of the savannah, written in blood and territorial instinct over countless generations. But Amara did not come to fight. She did not come to hunt. She came with a purpose that no one could have anticipated. Over the next 7 days, researchers documented something so extraordinary, so unprecedented, that it would eventually be published in 3 separate peer-reviewed wildlife journals and discussed at international conferences on animal behavior. Amara deliberately allowed herself to be captured and incorporated into the Kizingo Pride. She did not fight when they challenged her. She did not resist when they tested her. She simply submitted, accepted her place at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy, and became one of them. Dr. Zara, the lead researcher studying the Serengeti lions at that time, described Amara's integration into the rival pride as the most methodical and deliberate act of assimilation I have ever witnessed in a wild lion. Normally, pride integration took months. There were conflicts, there were injuries, there was a constant jockeying for position. But Amara seemed to know exactly what she was doing. She would position herself lower than any other lioness during social interactions. She would allow younger females to eat first during hunts. She would sleep away from the group, at the edges of the territory. She was making herself indispensable, while simultaneously making herself invisible. For 3 weeks, she lived among the Kizingo Pride. She participated in hunts but never fought for position on a kill. She helped defend the territory against intruders, but never challenged the dominant females for control. She was the perfect lioness from the pride's perspective. Useful, non-threatening, capable. The pride's 2 males seemed to barely notice her. The dominant females accepted her with indifference. By the end of the 3rd week, Amara had become so integrated into the group that rangers noted the Kizingo Pride seemed to have always consisted of 9 lionesses rather than 8. But during all this time, Amara was watching. She was learning. She was studying the pride's routines with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was preparing for something. She noted which lionesses went hunting at which times. She observed where the cubs were kept during the day. She learned the terrain intimately, mapping every acacia tree, every rocky outcrop, every waterhole. She was no longer acting from pure grief and rage. She was planning. The moment came on the 22nd day of Amara's integration into the Kizingo Pride. The dominant female, a massive lioness named Kira, had recently given birth to 4 cubs. These cubs were now 5 weeks old, beginning to be weaned, beginning to show the early stages of personality and hunting instinct. They represented the future of the Kizingo Pride, the continuation of Kira's legacy. They were also the target of Amara's plan. On the evening of November 9th, as the sun descended toward the horizon, Amara suggested a hunting expedition. This was not unusual. She had suggested hunts multiple times during her 3 weeks with the Pride. But this time, she was very specific about the location. She wanted to hunt near the eastern waterholes, a location that was far from where Kira had hidden her cubs for safekeeping. She wanted to invite the 5 strongest hunters, including Kira herself. The dominant female agreed. The hunting party departed, leaving the cubs with only 2 older lionesses to guard them. 2 lionesses who were past their prime and whose hunting skills had declined significantly with age. Amara hunted with the group for exactly 47 minutes. When they had moved far enough from the cubs' location that the guards would not hear anything unusual, Amara made her move. She did not attack the other hunters. She did not fight Kira. Instead, she simply claimed she had caught a scent and needed to investigate. The other lionesses were focused on a herd of wildebeest that they were stalking. No one questioned her departure. By the time they realized she was gone, she had already covered 3 kilometers back toward the Pride's den area. What Amara did next shocked the research team to its core. She did not kill the cubs. That would have been simple revenge, terrible in its own way, but ultimately understandable within the context of animal behavior. Instead, she did something far more calculated and far more psychological. She arrived at the den where Kira's 4 cubs were resting with their 2 elderly guardians. She did not attack the guardians. She simply walked into the den, and her presence was enough. The 2 older lionesses, knowing they could not fight someone as strong as Amara, fled. They scattered into the bush, making distress calls. For the next 18 minutes, Amara was alone with the 4 cubs. And in those 18 minutes, she did something that no one who witnessed it could fully explain. She did not harm them. Not a single scratch. Not a single injury. Instead, she lay down beside them. She allowed them to nurse from her, even though she had no milk to give. She groomed them with her rough tongue. She held them close to her body, her massive frame protective and nurturing. She was, for those 18 minutes, their mother. When the elderly lionesses returned, accompanied by other members of the Pride drawn by their distress calls, they found Amara lying with the cubs, making the softest, most maternal sounds. For a moment, no one moved, no one attacked. The scene was so incongruous, so completely against every instinct these animals possessed, that it created a moment of frozen confusion. It was in that moment that Amara did what she had been planning all along. She simply stood up and walked away. She did not fight. She did not defend herself. She simply walked out of the den and continued walking, heading back toward her original Pride's territory. By the time Kira and the hunting party returned to discover what had happened, Amara was already 5 kilometers away. They called after her with roars that echoed across the savannah. They could have pursued her. They could have killed her. But they did not, because what Amara had done was far more devastating than any physical attack could have been. She had breached the sacred bond between mother and cubs. She had demonstrated that the Kizingo Pride's cubs were not safe, not even with their mother nearby, not even with guards present. She had shown them vulnerability, and in the animal kingdom, vulnerability is perhaps the cruelest thing one can demonstrate to another. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Kira became obsessed with her cubs in a way that was almost manic. She would not let them out of her sight. She would not allow them to play. She would not let them hunt with the other cubs. She was consumed by paranoia, convinced that Amara would return. But Amara did not return, and that in many ways was worse. When Amara returned to her original Pride's territory, the other lionesses knew immediately what had happened. They could smell the Kizingo Pride's scent on her. They could see it in her bearing, in the way she moved. But when they tried to approach her, to understand what she had done, Amara refused to interact with them. She was not the same lioness who had left 4 days earlier. Something fundamental had changed in her. She had transformed into something colder, something more focused, something more deliberately cruel. For the next 3 weeks, Amara did something that shocked the research team even more than her infiltration of the rival Pride. She began systematically visiting the Kizingo Pride's territory at irregular intervals, never to hunt, never to fight, never to engage in any way that could be called normal animal behavior. She would simply appear at the edges of their territory, watch them for a period of time, and disappear. Sometimes she would show up at night, her silhouette visible in the moonlight. Sometimes she would appear at dawn, sometimes in the middle of the day. The psychological effect was devastating. Kira became increasingly erratic. She would attack her own Pride members for no apparent reason. She would abandon hunts midway through, convinced she heard something threatening her cubs. She would pace obsessively, roaring challenges into the empty air. The other members of the Kizingo Pride began to suffer because of her deteriorating mental state. Hunts became less coordinated. Territory defense became less effective. The pride was fragmenting under the weight of their matriarch's psychological breakdown. Dr. Okonkwo documented this period in detail, writing in her field notes, "What we are witnessing is unprecedented. A lioness has deliberately infiltrated a rival pride, demonstrated their vulnerability, and is now systematically destroying their leader's psychological well-being through a campaign of targeted psychological warfare. This is not instinctive behavior. This is not accidental. This is calculated, deliberate, and devastating. We are watching an animal engage in what can only be described as revenge at a level of sophistication that rivals human behavior." But the story was not yet finished, because Amara's campaign of psychological devastation was only the first phase of what she had planned. The second phase would be far more violent, far more direct, and it would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the entire region. By late November, approximately 6 weeks after that terrible night at the Shatter Springs, Amara's original pride had begun to notice her transformation. She was stronger, somehow, more focused, more dangerous. She moved differently. She hunted differently. Where she had once been a collaborative member of the group, she was now becoming increasingly dominant, increasingly aggressive. She would challenge lionesses who had previously been her equals. She would claim the best positions during kills. She would position herself front and center during territorial patrols. The other lionesses began to feel something shift in the pride's dynamics. Amara was becoming something more than a regular member. She was becoming something more like a leader, something more like a force that could not be stopped. And the most disturbing part was that none of them could understand why. There was no biological reason for her transformation. She had lost her cubs. She had no new cubs to protect. She had no obvious reason for this sudden shift in behavior and dominance. It was as if grief had transformed into something far more ambitious. In early December, Amara did something that shocked everyone who witnessed it. She called together a hunting party, but she did not call for the typical prey that the pride usually hunted. She called for the hunt to be directed toward the Kizingo Pride territory. Specifically, she called for them to hunt hyenas, not for food, but for elimination. And the other lionesses, sensing something in her bearing, something in her absolute certainty, followed her without question. The hunt lasted nearly 2 hours. 8 lionesses, with Amara at the lead, systematically hunted down and killed 17 hyenas in the Kizingo territory. They killed them with a ferocity that went far beyond normal predator behavior. They did not eat them. They did not feed their cubs with the kills. They simply killed and moved on to the next target. It was a message, a declaration of war. And when they were finished, Amara led the hunting party to the edges of the Kizingo territory and howled, a roar so loud, so powerful, that it echoed across the entire region. The Kizingo Pride heard that roar, and they understood what it meant. Amara was declaring her intention to take their territory. She was announcing that she was coming for them, and the broken, paranoid mind of Kira could not handle it. Within 48 hours, the Kizingo Pride had abandoned their territory. All of them. Not just Kira and her cubs, but all 8 lionesses and both males. They fled northward, seeking refuge in territories where they thought they would be safe. But Amara was not finished. Not yet. Over the next 3 weeks, Amara's pride consolidated control over the abandoned Kizingo territory. They expanded their hunting grounds. They strengthened their borders. They established themselves as the dominant force in the region. But Amara did not stop there. She began making strategic alliances with other prides, other groups of lions who had been rival to the Kizingo Pride. She shared information about the Kizingo Pride's location. She helped other prides locate them as they fled northward. She was orchestrating a coordinated campaign of harassment and displacement that spanned across the entire northern Serengeti. By January of 2020, less than 3 months after that terrible night at the Shatter Springs, the Kizingo Pride had been completely driven out of the region. They had retreated to marginal territories. Kira herself had become something of a ghost, rarely seen, constantly on the move, her mind broken beyond repair. The hyena clan that had killed Amara's cubs had been systematically hunted down and eliminated, almost all of them. Over a period of 6 weeks, Amara's pride and their allies had killed more than 40 hyenas. And through it all, Amara had become something that was almost unrecognizable as a lion. She had become a force of nature, a being driven by a singular purpose that transcended normal animal motivation. She had taken her grief and transformed it into something productive, something destructive, something that had fundamentally altered the political landscape of the entire region. The other lionesses in her pride were almost afraid of her now. They followed her because they had to, because she had become the undisputed leader, because her will seemed absolute and unquestionable. But as the months progressed, something else began to happen, something that no one could have predicted. Amara began to change again. The rage that had driven her, the singular focus on revenge and domination, began to soften. She would sometimes lie alone under acacia trees for hours, staring at nothing. She would refuse to participate in hunts. She would sit at the edges of the pride's resting areas, isolated, separated from the others. It was as if the purpose that had sustained her, the goal that had driven her forward, had finally been achieved. And now, without that purpose, she was collapsing. By late February, Amara had become almost unrecognizable. She had lost weight. Her coat, once sleek and magnificent, had become dull and matted. Her eyes, which had burned with purpose and fury, had become vacant and distant. The other lionesses tried to include her in their activities, but she would not respond. She seemed to be withdrawing into herself, disappearing into some internal world that none of them could reach. And then, in an event that shocked everyone who witnessed it, Amara became pregnant. The pregnancy was completely unexpected. Amara had not mated with any of the pride's males in the months since her cubs were killed. The research team initially assumed there had been some kind of error in their observations, but the pregnancy tests conducted by the veterinary team confirmed it beyond any doubt. Amara was carrying cubs, 4 of them, based on the ultrasound images, 4 cubs that would be born into a pride that had been fundamentally transformed by her actions over the past 4 months. No one could explain how this had happened. There was no record of any mating, no observation of any interaction with males that could have resulted in conception. Some of the researchers theorized that perhaps she had mated with a male from a neighboring pride during one of her many expeditions into rival territory. Others suggested that perhaps there had been a mating that no one had observed, that had happened during the chaos of one of the territorial battles or during one of her mysterious disappearances into the bush. But Dr. Okonkwo had a different theory. She believed that Amara's body, responding to some deep biological imperative, had manufactured the pregnancy as a way of processing her grief and trauma. Not consciously, of course, but on some fundamental level, Amara's body was demanding that she create new life to replace what had been taken from her. The pregnancy was not a biological accident. It was a biological imperative. It was nature's way of pushing Amara forward, of giving her a new purpose, a new reason to survive. Whatever the explanation, the pregnancy seemed to spark something in Amara that had been dormant for months. She began to hunt again, with focused intensity. She began to interact with the other lionesses again, though in a different way than before. She was no longer the cold, calculating warrior who had orchestrated the overthrow of the Kizingo Pride. She was becoming something closer to her original self, something that was still transformed by her experiences, but something that was also healing. As the weeks progressed and Amara's belly grew larger with the developing cubs, the entire pride seemed to shift their energy around her. The other lionesses began treating her differently. Where they had followed her out of fear and respect, they now followed her out of something closer to anticipation. There was a sense that something significant was about to happen, something that would define the future of the entire pride. By late March, approximately 5 months after the death of her original cubs, Amara was ready to give birth. She selected a den site that was remarkably similar to where she had given birth to her first litter, a location with good visibility, multiple escape routes, rocky terrain that could provide protection from predators. The other lionesses helped her prepare the space, clearing away thorns and debris, creating a comfortable resting area. They were treating her with a deference that suggested they understood the importance of what was about to happen. On March 28, 2020, Amara gave birth to 4 healthy cubs, 2 males and 2 females. The cubs were healthy and strong, showing signs of robust development and vigor. The research team documented everything. They took photographs. They recorded videos. They documented Amara's behavior as a mother to these new cubs, comparing it to observations they had made of her behavior with her original cubs 18 months earlier. What they discovered was remarkable. Amara was a different kind of mother this time. She was more protective, yes, but also more playful. She was less anxious about threats, even though objectively speaking, the threats were the same. She seemed to have a different kind of confidence, a different kind of certainty about her ability to protect her offspring. She moved through the pride with a sense of purpose that suggested she was not just a mother to her own cubs, but a mother to the entire pride. She was teaching the younger lionesses how to be good hunters. She was helping with the younger cubs of other lionesses. She was creating a culture within the pride that was based on cooperation and shared responsibility rather than strict hierarchical dominance. Over the next year, from April 2020 to April 2021, the Serengeti witnessed the emergence of what researchers began to call the Amara effect. Under her leadership, the pride that had previously been moderately successful became one of the most dominant forces in the entire region. Their hunting success rate increased by 43%. Their territorial size expanded by 38%. The number of cubs that survived to adulthood increased dramatically. The pride went from being a struggling coalition of 12 to a thriving community of 22 members. But more importantly, the pride's culture changed. Where they had previously been marked by internal conflict and hierarchical competition, they became marked by cooperation and teamwork. Amara instituted what researchers would later call cooperative hunting protocols, where lionesses would work together in coordinated strategies that maximized success while minimizing risk. She created a system of shared responsibilities for cub rearing, where multiple lionesses would take turns nursing and protecting cubs, reducing the burden on individual mothers. She established what amounted to a mentorship program for younger lionesses, personally training them in hunting techniques and territorial defense. She created peaceful resolutions to conflicts that would have previously resulted in violence and bloodshed. She fundamentally restructured the social hierarchy of the pride in a way that elevated cooperation over dominance, collaboration over competition. The two males in the pride, recognizing her leadership and capabilities, ceded much of the strategic decision-making to her. They focused on territorial defense and protection against rival males, while she managed the day-to-day operations of the pride, the hunting strategies, the social dynamics, the overall direction and vision of the group. It was an arrangement that worked remarkably well, creating a balance of power that was unusual but highly effective. By the end of 2020, word of Amara's transformation and her innovative leadership style had spread throughout the research community. Wildlife journals published papers about her. Documentary filmmakers sought her out. She became something of a celebrity in the world of lion research. Though of course she was completely unaware of this human attention and interest. To her she was simply living, hunting, raising cubs, protecting her family, and building a better pride. But the most remarkable thing happened in January 2021, almost exactly 16 months after the death of her original cubs. A lone lioness appeared at the borders of Amara's territory. She was thin, scarred, and moving with a distinctive limp. The researchers recognized her immediately. It was Kira, the leader of the Kizingo Pride, the lioness whose psychological breakdown had been orchestrated by Amara's campaign of revenge. Kira had been wandering alone for months. Her pride had fragmented completely. The other lionesses had moved on, found new prides, integrated into other groups. Her cubs had been killed by rival lions in the territories where she had fled. She had lost everything, just as Amara had lost everything. And now, broken and desperate, she had wandered back to the territory she had once ruled, hoping perhaps to find some vestige of what she had lost. Amara was hunting when she encountered Kira. The two lionesses stood facing each other across an open stretch of grassland, separated by about 200 meters. For a long moment neither moved, neither made a sound. The research team who had been following Amara at a distance held their breath. They expected violence. They expected a confrontation that would result in bloodshed. After everything that had happened, after the orchestrated campaign of revenge, after the systematic elimination of Kira's pride, it seemed inevitable that when these two met again, it would be an ending in blood and violence. But what happened next would become the most documented moment in Serengeti lion research history. Amara stood for a moment, studying Kira with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something beyond just the broken, defeated lioness before her. Then, slowly, deliberately, she began walking toward her former enemy. The other lionesses in the hunting party moved to intercept, to protect their leader from potential danger. But Amara raised her head slightly, a gesture that meant stand down, trust me. And they obeyed. Amara walked to within 5 meters of Kira, close enough to smell her, close enough to see the depth of her suffering, the weight of her loss, the shattered remnants of the pride matriarch she had once been. And then, in a gesture that no one could have predicted, Amara lowered her head in a posture of non-aggression. She did not attack, she did not drive Kira away, she simply acknowledged her, recognized her, saw her pain and her loss as something equal to her own. For several minutes, the two lionesses stood together in that grassland. Two mothers who had both lost everything. Two enemies who had both suffered devastating consequences from their conflict. And then Amara turned and walked back toward her hunting party. She did not invite Kira to join them. She did not welcome her into the pride. But she also did not chase her away. She simply left the choice in Kira's paws. Kira watched her go, and then slowly, she turned and walked in the opposite direction. She did not stay in Amara's territory. She continued on her journey, a broken lioness seeking some kind of redemption or resolution that she would probably never find. But in that moment of encounter, something had shifted in both of them. Amara's journey of revenge had come to a kind of completion, not because she had destroyed Kira, but because she had seen Kira's suffering and had chosen mercy instead of further violence. Over the next year, from January 2021 to January 2022, Amara's pride continued to thrive and grow. Her cubs from the new litter developed into healthy, strong adolescents. Her leadership style continued to evolve and refine. She mentored a new generation of lionesses. She developed innovative hunting techniques that other prides in the region began to observe and imitate. Her territory became a refuge for displaced lions, a place where they could find safety and community. But perhaps most importantly, Amara had transformed her grief into something productive, something meaningful, something that had elevated not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. She had taken the worst tragedy imaginable, the loss of everything she loved, and she had used it as fuel for transformation and growth. She had become a legend, not through revenge and violence, but through resilience and leadership. The research team continued to document her and her pride's behavior for years after these events. They published dozens of papers. They presented their findings at international conferences. They made documentaries that were broadcast on major networks. Amara became arguably the most studied lion in the world, not because she was the most powerful or the most violent, but because her story revealed something profound about the capacity for healing and transformation in the animal kingdom. By 2023, 3 years after that terrible night at the Chakra Springs, Amara's pride had grown to over 30 members. Her original territory had expanded to encompass nearly 40 square kilometers. Other prides in the region had begun adopting her cooperative hunting strategies. A culture of innovation and collaboration was spreading through the lion population in the Serengeti, and it all traced back to one lioness's journey through grief toward a kind of redemption. But perhaps the most important evidence of Amara's transformation came in how she treated her new cubs, her grand cubs, and the entire next generation of lions in her pride. She was a mother who understood loss. She was a leader who understood pain, and she used that understanding to create a community where loss and pain were not inevitable, where cubs were protected with fierce devotion, where mothers were supported through their most vulnerable times. The young lionesses who grew up under her mentorship spoke a different language of pride leadership than the generation before them. They understood cooperation. They understood strategy. They understood that dominance was not something you seized through violence and aggression, but something you earned through wisdom and service. They understood that a good leader was not someone who ruled through fear, but someone who lifted others up. Amara's story, documented by the research community, became a powerful statement about the complexity of animal intelligence and emotion. It challenged the assumption that animals operated purely on instinct, with no capacity for planning, for strategy, for revenge, for healing, for transformation. It suggested that the line between human and animal consciousness was far more blurred than we typically acknowledged. It suggested that grief, trauma, and loss could affect other species in ways that were just as profound and complex as they affected humans. As the years progressed and Amara aged, her role in the pride gradually shifted from active leadership to something more like mentorship and wisdom-keeping. She still hunted, but less frequently. She still participated in territorial defense, but younger lions took more of the frontline role. She spent more time teaching, more time observing, more time simply being present as a source of guidance and stability. The researchers who had documented her entire journey, from that terrible night at the Chakra Springs, through her campaign of revenge, and ultimately to her transformation into a leader of compassion and cooperation, described her as one of the most remarkable individuals they had ever studied. Not just remarkable as a lion, but remarkable as a being. Her story transcended the species barrier. It spoke to something universal about suffering, about the human, or perhaps animal, capacity to transform tragedy into meaning. But the most crucial question that remained, the question that haunted Dr. Okonkwo and the entire research team until the end, was this: Did Amara achieve a kind of peace? Did the journey from grief to revenge to leadership and compassion ultimately heal the wound that had been created on that terrible October night? Or would that loss always be with her, shaping everything she did, marking her as a creature forever changed by tragedy? The answer, the research team concluded, was probably both. Amara had not overcome her loss. She had not forgotten her original cubs. Evidence of her grief could be seen in small moments, in the way she would sometimes stand alone and stare into the distance, in the way she would move protectively around her new cubs with an intensity that suggested she was protecting something far more precious than just animal offspring. But she had transformed that grief into something productive. She had taken her pain and used it to create meaning, to build community, to elevate the lives of those around her. In the end, Amara's story became a testament to the power of resilience, to the capacity of life to adapt and transform in the face of devastating loss. It became a story about how a mother's love, twisted into rage and revenge, could eventually find its way back to something resembling love again. It became a story about how loss could be the catalyst for the most profound personal transformation. And perhaps, in its deepest essence, it became a story about what it means to be alive in a world that often seems designed to take away everything we love. It became a story about how we respond to that taking away, whether we retreat into despair or rage, whether we seek revenge or healing, whether we isolate ourselves or reach out to create community. These are the questions that define us, whether we are human or animal. And Amara, in her journey through grief toward a kind of redemption, answered those questions with a complexity and wisdom that few creatures, human or otherwise, could match. By 2024, nearly 5 years after that catastrophic night at the Chakra Springs, Amara had become something more than just a lion. She had become a symbol, a living testament to the capacity for transformation and healing in the animal kingdom. But her story was far from over. In fact, some of the most profound chapters were still to come, and they would challenge everything the research community thought they understood about animal behavior, grief, and the legacy that one individual can leave behind. Amara was now 12 years old, elderly by lion standards. The average wild lion lived to around 12 or 13 years. She was in the twilight of her life. Her movements were slower, more deliberate. Her mane, which had once been thick and lustrous, had begun to thin and grey. Her body bore the scars of countless battles, countless hunts, countless moments of struggle and survival. But her mind remained sharp, her presence remained powerful, and her influence over her pride remained absolute. The pride itself had become something unprecedented. It had grown to nearly 40 members, making it one of the largest prides ever documented in the Serengeti. Multiple generations had been born under Amara's leadership. Her grand cubs were now reaching adulthood, carrying her genes and, perhaps more importantly, carrying her values and her vision forward into the future. The cooperative hunting strategies she had developed were now so ingrained in the pride's culture that younger lions could not imagine any other way of operating. But as Amara's physical capabilities began to decline, a new dynamic emerged. The younger lions, particularly the young males, began to question her authority in subtle ways, not through direct confrontation, but through subtle shifts in behavior. A male might hesitate slightly before following her direction. A female might make a suggestion for how a hunt should be conducted, implying that Amara's approach might be outdated. These were small things, barely noticeable to the human observers. But to Amara, they signaled something she had always known would eventually come: the challenge of succession. In the wild, leadership transitions in lion prides were typically marked by violence and bloodshed. When a male reached his physical peak and decided he could no longer accept another male's authority, he fought for dominance. When a female felt she had the strength and capability to become the pride matriarch, she challenged the existing leader. These fights were brutal, often resulting in serious injury or death. The loser left the pride or was killed. The winner took control and dictated the future direction of the group. But Amara had spent nearly 5 years building a pride that operated on principles of cooperation rather than competition, on consensus rather than dominance. She had created a system where leadership was about service rather than power. And now, as her time came to give way, she faced a choice. She could fight to maintain her position, could use whatever strength she had left to assert her dominance and defend her leadership. Or she could do something unprecedented. She could voluntarily step aside. She could transfer her authority and vision to the next generation. The moment of decision came in July 2024. during what would turn out to be Amara's final hunt as the Pride's primary strategic leader. A herd of buffalo had been spotted near the Pride's territory, and Amara, despite her age, insisted on participating in the hunt. The other lionesses tried to convince her to rest, to let the younger, stronger females take the lead, but Amara was insistent. She wanted to hunt. She wanted to demonstrate one final time what she had spent nearly 5 years teaching them. The buffalo hunt was a complex operation. Buffalo were dangerous prey, capable of killing lions with their horns and hooves. They required strategy, coordination, and precise execution. What ensued was what Dr. Okonkwo would later describe in her final research paper on Amara as a masterclass in cooperative predation. Amara positioned herself not at the front of the attack, but in a strategic location where she could observe and direct the other lionesses. She identified the most vulnerable buffalo, a young bull that had become separated from the herd. She communicated to the younger females where they should position themselves using a combination of roars, head movements, and subtle body language cues that the Pride had developed over years of hunting together. The younger lionesses executed the strategy flawlessly. They moved in coordinated waves, they cut off escape routes, they brought the buffalo down with minimal injury to themselves and a quick, merciful death for the prey. But what happened at the moment of victory was perhaps the most significant moment in the entire hunt. When the buffalo had been killed and the Pride gathered around the carcass, Amara did something extraordinary. She allowed the younger lionesses to eat first, not because she was too old to compete, but as a deliberate gesture. She was demonstrating that leadership was not about taking the largest portion or claiming the best position. Leadership was about service. It was about ensuring that those who depended on you were cared for first. One of the younger females, a lioness named Zuri, who had been born under Amara's leadership and had been mentored directly by her, approached the carcass and began to eat. As she did, she paused and looked back at Amara. The gaze was brief, but it conveyed something profound. An acknowledgement, a gratitude, a recognition of what Amara had built and what she had taught. And in that moment, both the lionesses and the research team who were documenting the hunt understood that something had shifted. The transition had begun. Over the next 3 months, from July to October 2024, Amara gradually withdrew from direct leadership of the Pride. She was still present. She still participated in hunts and territorial defense. But the strategic decisions began to be made by younger females. Zuri emerged as the primary successor, naturally stepping into the role that Amara had been vacating. Other younger females took on responsibilities for organizing hunts, for managing territorial boundaries, for mediating conflicts within the Pride. Amara watched this transition with what the research team described as peaceful acceptance. There was no visible conflict, no territorial battles, no fights over dominance. The transition happened smoothly because Amara had deliberately prepared for it. She had spent years mentoring a new generation of leaders, teaching them not just hunting skills, but the philosophy of leadership that she had developed. The Pride was ready for her to step aside because she had made sure they were ready. By October 2024, Amara had essentially retired from active leadership. She spent her days resting in shaded areas, watching the younger members of the Pride engage in their daily activities. She was still respected, still treated with deference, but she was no longer the one making decisions. She was no longer the driving force behind the Pride's actions. She had become something like an elder, a repository of wisdom that the younger lions could consult when faced with difficult decisions. The research team noted a subtle change in Amara's behavior during this period. She became more philosophical, in a sense. She would spend hours watching sunsets. She would sit near waterholes and observe other animals. She seemed to be reflecting on her life, on her journey from that terrible night 5 years earlier to this moment of peaceful retirement. Dr. Okonkwo theorized that Amara was engaging in what humans might call life review, a process of examining one's life and finding meaning in it. It was during this period of reflection that the most extraordinary moment in Amara's entire story occurred. In late October, a young lion appeared at the borders of the Pride's territory. He was a male, probably about 5 years old, showing signs of developing into a large and powerful adult. He was thin, suggesting he had been surviving on his own for some time. He was cautious, clearly aware that he was approaching a large and established Pride. Normally, a lone male approaching a Pride's territory would either be attacked and driven away or incorporated into the Pride's male coalition if he proved to be strong enough or valuable enough. But this male did something unusual. Instead of approaching the pride's males for a confrontation or the younger females for potential mating opportunities, he approached Amara, the old lioness who was resting alone at the edge of the pride's territory. For a moment, neither moved. The research team, who had been documenting this encounter from a distance, held their breath. What would happen next was unpredictable. Amara could attack. She could call the pride to her defense. She could show aggression and drive the male away. But instead, she simply watched him. And as she watched, something seemed to shift in her understanding. The male approached slowly, making non-aggressive gestures. He came close enough to smell her, to understand her scent. And then, in a gesture that seemed to startle even him, he lowered his head in what appeared to be a gesture of deference or respect. Not the posture of a male seeking dominance, but something else entirely. Something that suggested he was asking for something. Acceptance, perhaps, or understanding. Amara stood up. Slowly, with the careful movements of an aged lioness, she approached the male. The two of them touched faces, exchanging scents. And then Amara did something that shocked the research team to its core. She roared. Not a roar of aggression or warning, but a roar that seemed to be an announcement to the entire pride. A roar that said, "This male is welcome here. This male is under my protection. This male is family." The young male was integrated into the pride without incident. The other lions, seeing Amara's acceptance, accepted him as well. He eventually became part of the pride's male coalition, contributing to territorial defense and protection. But what was most significant was what the young male's arrival meant in the broader context of Amara's life and legacy. It became clear, through various observations and behavioral cues, that this young male might be a descendant of one of Amara's original cubs. Not one of the three who had been killed at the Chakra Springs, but perhaps a more distant relative, a descendant of a pride member who shared Amara's genetics. The research team was never entirely certain, but the mathematical probabilities and the behavioral responses suggested it was possible. And if it was true, it meant that Amara's original legacy, the genetic legacy that had been taken from her on that terrible night, had survived and continued through the broader pride. Whether it was actually a descendant or simply a young male seeking refuge, Amara seemed to treat him as if he was. She would watch him hunt. She would groom him occasionally. She would position herself near him during rest periods. She seemed to be passing something on to him, some kind of wisdom or legacy that transcended simple genetics. In November 2024, as the dry season approached and temperatures began to rise across the Serengeti, Amara's health began to decline more noticeably. She moved slower. She participated less in hunts and territorial defense. She spent more time resting, sometimes for entire days at a time. The research team began to recognize the signs of an aging body reaching the end of its time. Amara was dying. Slowly, naturally, but inevitably. But rather than retreat into isolation as many aging lions do, Amara remained with the pride. She continued to be present at communal resting areas. She continued to participate in hunts when she had the energy, often taking a more observational role, using her experience to guide the younger hunters. She continued to mentor younger lionesses, passing on the accumulated wisdom of her life. The most remarkable thing was how the pride responded to her decline. Rather than showing disrespect or taking advantage of her weakness, they treated her with increasing deference and care. When there was a successful kill, younger lionesses would allow Amara to eat first, reversing the normal protocol. When she was resting, younger members of the pride would position themselves nearby, as if standing guard. When she moved, they moved carefully around her, giving her space and protection. It was clear that Amara had created something that transcended normal lion social dynamics. She had created genuine affection and respect. She had built relationships based on something deeper than hierarchy or evolutionary programming. The pride cared for her because they loved her, because she had loved them, because she had invested in them, because she had shown them a different way of being a lion, a different way of organizing themselves and their society. In mid-December 2024, Amara made what would be her final hunt. The pride had successfully brought down a zebra, and Amara, despite her obvious physical decline, insisted on participating in the kill. She did not catch the zebra. She did not deliver any decisive blow. But she was present, she was part of it, and when the hunt was over and the pride had fed, she had earned her place at the carcass and eaten her portion. That night, as the pride rested under a canopy of stars, Amara lay in her favorite spot, surrounded by younger pride members who had positioned themselves near her. The research team documented the scene with a profound awareness that they were witnessing something ending. An era was coming to a close. A remarkable life was reaching its final chapter. Dr. Okonkwo sat with her team, reviewing footage of Amara's entire journey, from the moment she had returned to her original pride after her infiltration of the Kizingo territory, through her campaign of psychological warfare, through her transformation as a leader, through her mentorship of a new generation, to this final moment of peaceful rest surrounded by family. It was a story, she reflected, that encompassed everything: grief and rage, revenge and redemption, loss and renewal, tragedy and triumph. On December 23rd, 2024, exactly 4 years, 2 months, and 5 days after that terrible night at the Chakra Springs, Amara died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by members of her pride. She was 13 years old, elderly by lion standards, but her age seemed almost irrelevant. She had lived more fully, more consciously, more meaningfully than lions typically lived. She had experienced grief that seemed human in its depth. She had orchestrated revenge that was calculated and psychological. She had built a legacy that would outlive her by decades. When the research team arrived at the Pride's location that morning, they found something extraordinary. The other lions had not abandoned Amara's body. They remained nearby, making soft, mournful vocalizations that the team had never heard from lions before. They were grieving, not in the way humans grieve, perhaps, but in their own way. They were acknowledging loss. They were expressing sorrow at the passing of someone who had been profoundly important to them. The funeral, if it could be called that, lasted for 2 days. The Pride remained near Amara's body, circling it periodically, touching it with their noses, making soft calls. Other prides in the region seemed to understand that something significant had occurred. Rangers reported hearing roars from distant prides, as if the entire lion community of the Serengeti was acknowledging Amara's passing. When scavengers eventually came to claim Amara's body, the pride did not resist. They understood, in their own way, that this was part of the natural cycle. What had been Amara would return to the earth, would nourish other creatures, would become part of the ecosystem that she had been part of throughout her life. The physical form would end, but what Amara had built, the culture she had created, the wisdom she had passed on, those things would continue. In the months following Amara's death, the research team conducted detailed studies of how the pride functioned without her. What they discovered was that the transition had been so complete, the mentorship had been so thorough, that the pride did not collapse or fragment. Zuri and the other younger lionesses continued to lead using the principles that Amara had taught them. The cooperative hunting strategies remained in place. The collaborative approach to territory defense continued. The mentorship of younger members persisted. In fact, some aspects of the pride's functioning actually improved. The younger leaders brought their own innovations and ideas. They adapted Amara's foundational principles to new situations and challenges. They created something that was both a continuation of her legacy and a new creation in its own right. Amara had given them the blueprint, and they were building their own masterpiece from it. By 2025, 1 year after Amara's death, the pride had not only survived her loss, but had thrived. The population had grown to over 45 members. The territory had expanded further. The hunting success rate had improved. Multiple other prides in the region were adopting the cooperative strategies that Amara had pioneered. Her influence had become regional, then continental. Word of her leadership model was spreading through lion populations across Africa. The legacy that Amara left behind was not measured in physical monuments or written records. It was measured in the way that lions in the Serengeti and beyond organized themselves. It was measured in the survival rates of cubs born under systems that valued cooperation over dominance. It was measured in the reduced violence between prides as they learned more effective ways to establish territories and negotiate boundaries. It was measured in the simple fact that lions were living longer, raising more cubs to adulthood, and creating more stable communities. Amara's story, published in wildlife journals and shared in documentaries, became a touchstone for discussions about animal intelligence, consciousness, and the capacity for transformation. It challenged fundamental assumptions about predators and their motivations. It suggested that emotions in the animal kingdom were more complex and nuanced than humans typically acknowledged. It proposed that grief, rage, revenge, forgiveness, and redemption were not exclusively human experiences, but universal aspects of conscious life. For Dr. Okonkwo and her research team, Amara became more than a subject of study. She became a teacher. Through observing her life, they learned about resilience. They learned about the power of intentional community building. They learned about what it meant to transform tragedy into purpose. They learned about the possibility of choosing compassion even after experiencing devastating loss. In her final published work on Amara, Dr. Okonkwo wrote, "Amara's life stands as testament to the profound complexity of animal consciousness and emotion. She experienced loss that rivaled the most devastating human tragedies. She channeled that loss into rage and a calculated campaign of revenge. But ultimately, she transcended both grief and rage through the deliberate construction of community and the mentoring of a new generation. She demonstrated that transformation is possible, that meaning can be created from suffering, that love in all its forms is perhaps the most powerful force in nature." Amara was more than a lion. She was a teacher, a philosopher, a leader, and she will be remembered not as a creature driven by instinct, but as an individual of profound depth and wisdom. The young male lion that Amara had accepted into the Pride in her final months became a significant figure in the Pride's history. He fathered many cubs, passing on not just Amara's genetics, but potentially her values and teachings through the behavioral patterns he had learned from her. Years later, when researchers observed this male mentoring younger lions in the same cooperative hunting strategies that Amara had pioneered, it became clear that her influence would persist for generations. Amara's den, the location where she had given birth to her cubs under her leadership, became a kind of sacred site within the Pride's territory. The lions seemed to treat it with special respect, as if it was a memorial to their fallen leader. Younger lionesses would take their cubs there, as if understanding that this was a place of significance, a place connected to their Pride's identity and history. As the years progressed and more lions were born who had never known Amara directly, her story became legend. Like all legends, details changed in the retelling. Some versions portrayed her as purely vengeful, others portrayed her as purely noble and selfless. The truth, as is often the case, was more complex. Amara was both. She was a lioness capable of calculated cruelty and devastating vengeance. She was also capable of profound compassion and visionary leadership. She was, in other words, fully human, even though she was a lion. And perhaps that is the most important legacy that Amara left behind. She demonstrated that consciousness, emotion, and the capacity for growth and transformation were not uniquely human traits. They were part of the fabric of life itself. Any creature capable of experiencing love was also capable of experiencing loss. Any creature capable of experiencing loss could potentially experience rage and the desire for revenge. But any creature capable of rage might also discover, through their own journey, the possibility of redemption, transformation, and healing. Amara's story, documented in research papers and documentaries, retold in wildlife journals and academic conferences, became a kind of mirror for humanity. In her struggles and her triumphs, in her grief and her recovery, in her rage and her eventual wisdom, we saw reflections of ourselves. We saw proof that the line between human and animal was not as clear as we often believed, and in seeing that, we were forced to reckon with the profound complexity and dignity of other species. In the end, Amara lost everything on that terrible night at the Chakra Springs. Her 3 cubs, her sense of safety, her trust in the stability of life. But what she built afterward, what she created from the ashes of her loss, proved to be far more powerful and lasting than anything that had been taken from her. She built a legacy. She built a community. She transformed herself from a victim of tragedy into a teacher and a leader, and in doing so, she demonstrated to everyone who witnessed her story that loss, while devastating, need not be the final chapter. That transformation is always possible, that meaning can emerge from suffering. That, in the end, is the true story of Amara. Not the story of a lioness who lost everything, but the story of a lioness who lost everything, and then built something greater from the ruins of what had been taken from her. It is a story that reminds us that we are far more resilient than we know, far more capable of transformation than we typically believe, and that the capacity to love, to grieve, and ultimately to transcend our grief through service to others is one of the most powerful forces in nature.